the Nation is international geopolitical analyst Pranjal Sharma. Pranjal, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you, Michael. Delighted to be here with you.
Yeah, now I happened to fortuitously meet Pranjal Sharma with some work that I was doing around the BRICS Business Summit. And Pranjal is not just a geopolitical analyst, he's also an author. And he's written this fantastic book, which is a take on the new economy and some of the changes. And what is really exciting is that we're going to be doing in a separate episode, we'll be doing a discussion around this book. But before we get to the book, Pranjal, the reason that we first spoke to each other was on the fringes of the BRICS summit. You were invited as one of the, just to come and observe and be part of the business summit. What was your take on the BRICS summit?
I think it's very exciting, firstly, that the BRICS summit was held in person after a gap because of COVID, as most global summits, Michael. But I think what was fascinating to me is that even at the beginning, one could see the excitement and enthusiasm, and the fact that more than 40 heads of state from the region were also present at the BRICS summit. And I had a occasion, as we had met, to see some of the exhibition where different countries from the African continent had also exhibited some of their products and services. So it was also for me to get a good glimpse of some of the great progress and development which has happened in the region.
Now, before we move on to the big issue, the big sort of talking point that emerged, which is the expansion of BRICS, let's talk about BRICS 1.0, or it's 1.5.0, I suppose, ever since South Africa's inclusion. And let's just look at the 5 countries that have been part of BRICS. Originally 4, South Africa were added in 2009. It's a bit of a strange grouping. I know it's been the point's been made many times, and not necessarily a natural grouping, not grouped necessarily by geography, by ideology. It's a disparate bunch, originally largely of large population countries that showed some growth potential, I suppose 15 years ago now, and led to the inclusion of South Africa. South Africa looks like the odd one out, and we seem a little bit desperate to be part of this thing. For starters, do you think South Africa deserved to be part of BRICS?
The BRICS was originally conceived as a group of countries which were outside the traditional OECD type of countries, the developed world, as it were, and they were seen. When the acronym was invented, it was to showcase the fact that there are this group of countries which are growing very rapidly, which are seeing a lot of economic development. And perhaps the future of global growth will be driven and influenced by these countries. To that extent, it was a natural grouping. It's not a geographical grouping. It is not a trade bloc. It is not like the European Union, which is contiguous on a specific landmass, or like NAFTA, which is North American Free Trade Agreement. It's not a free trade agreement. It's not a trade bloc. It's not a regional bloc either. So to that extent, I think BRICS, even without South Africa, when it was conceived, was a unique grouping in the world. The addition of South Africa was, I think, important and relevant because you cannot talk about growth economies without including the African continent, and South Africa being amongst the most ahead. I think it was natural to ensure that it is part of the conversation. And in that sense, it is, if you look at it, the original BRICS, once South Africa joined, brought very key representations from the key markets of the world outside US and Europe. So you would see there was Latin America, there's Africa, and of course the two giants from Asia. So to that extent, I think it makes a lot of sense. Remember that the economic center of gravity of the world is shifting away from US and Europe. The top growth countries and economies are not in US and North America and Europe anymore. And I like to say that these are the legacy economies of North America and Europe versus the growth economies of the rest of the world. From that perspective, if I were to use that lens, I would think that BRICS is a natural group to have.
Now, obviously, but if one were to judge this, I suppose, a little bit like a sports event, South Africa exceedingly lucky to be part of BRICS because we fail on almost every criteria that you mentioned. We don't have a particularly large population size. And even back in the halcyon days of 2009, when we muscled our way in, we had some growth, hardly spectacular, which has then sort of been completely lost at the altar of ideology. So South Africa doesn't bring a lot of economic heft to BRICS. This seems to make South Africa a bit of a toy of the bigger BRICS countries, to do the bidding of whoever needs one more voice within BRICS. Recently, South Africa has shown that by, supporting Russia in the invasion of Ukraine, supporting China against the West. Is South Africa doing itself any favors by being part of BRICS?
Well, look, there are different ways to interpret any grouping. My interpretation is that countries like South Africa, India, Brazil, and I would like to, put them together even within BRICS is because these are very important democracies. And China and Russia are limited democracies. But the three countries I mentioned, Brazil, India, South Africa, are far more robust democracies. And they're also open market economies. So to that extent, I think it's important for South Africa to be part of this. It represents a continent which is a continent of the future. It is a continent which is seeing rapid development. So it was natural for it to come in. Now, whether it is growing as rapidly or not, there's always a question of debate. But my sense is, and my argument is that today you see a very big shift, and this shift may not have been very visible when South Africa joined a few years ago. But remember that today, in the post-COVID and the post-Ukraine war situation, there is a very strong view that countries want to have their own say. I think many countries in the growth economies are very keen to develop their own agenda for growth. They want to reduce their dependence on US and Europe, North America and Europe, in terms of trade and investment. They feel that there are certain elements of colonial behavior which still remain. So now they're trying to forge a path which is somewhat independent. Today we live in a multipolar world, Michael, and to that extent, I don't think a country has to choose to be in one camp or the other. Just because you're pro-Russia doesn't mean you're anti-US. If you're pro-Europe, it doesn't mean you're anti-Russia either. So countries which are strong, which have independent-minded thinking, need to take a decision. They have to keep their own self-interest in mind ahead of geopolitics. There is a very interesting quote that India's foreign minister made a few months ago. And he said that there is a perception that Europe believes that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but world's problems are not Europe's problem. And if you keep this as a lens, I think this resonated and reverberated with a lot of countries across the world. They believe that whenever they had some challenges, the Western democracies did not come to their support. But when a crisis unfolds or a conflict unfolds in Europe, then the entire world is supposed to jump in and take sides. We are not in that era of First World War and Second World War where all colonies had to take a position. I mean, they didn't have a choice. They had to support whichever colonial master they were serving or they were under. Today, it's a more independent world. There are still vestiges of colonial and imperialistic behavior, but countries are now standing up to say that yes, we don't support the war, but at the same time, there is there has to be a nuance. The world is not black and white, and we will take a position based on our interest. So, if South Africa is in the middle, and while it condones the war, but it doesn't necessarily go into the European camp and does not necessarily go in the anti-Russia camp. I think it's very sensible for a country to take a call based on its own interests.
Well, you would say that if it wasn't absolutely diametrically in the opposite direction to South Africa's interests. South Africa does very little trade with Russia. It's less than 2% of our global trade. And our biggest trading partners by far are the EU and North America in terms of the purchase of South African manufactured goods. We are part of the AGOA agreement, the African Growth Opportunities Agreement with the US, which allows us tariff-free access to the US market. So therefore, we produce cars, etc., which go primarily to the US. So in a way, it's interesting because you live in India, which has taken that pragmatic view. They haven't supported the war. They've remained neutral. And they've acted in their own economic interests, and that I get. South Africa, who, everybody raises the point of our trade with China, but really what China buys from us are raw materials. That's it. That's all we really, they don't buy any of our manufactured goods. We are a net importer. We run a trade deficit with China because we purchased a lot of manufactured goods from China. So one could argue that it's not necessarily the greatest trade agreement, a necessary one, but not overly beneficial. So if what you say was true, and countries were then going to act in their best interest, what do you make of the fact that South Africa is clearly doing the exact opposite?
Well, India is in a similar position, Michael. We have a very strong trade and investment partnership with the US. We have very strong trade and investment partnership with the European Union, but also the individual countries and the leadership of, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy. We have very strong trade and investment relationships with them, and bilaterally so. Even in the last 18 months since the war has been on, the foreign investment from these countries to India has grown. But it doesn't mean that because I'm trading or I'm receiving investment, or India is also investing in other countries. We are one of the biggest investors in the United Kingdom today. We have also invested, and Indian companies have acquired entities in US and Europe. But that doesn't prevent us from taking a stand which we think is important for us. Because you are dependent on a country and you have to follow them is exactly the point which I made, that's the sentiment you see under colonial rule, that because you're controlled and you're dependent on a certain country, you have to follow everything that the country does. I don't think in today's world that is a logical or a responsible demand from anybody. I can have business links with you, but I can also agree to disagree with you. Because I do business with you does not mean that I have to follow everything that you do at 100% level. So I believe that countries today are standing up for it. And if you look at it, there is a realization that complete diplomatic isolation of Russia is also not going to yield any results. There is always need for countries to come together. And if you look at it, even within BRICS, Brazil and Russia and China, all of them have taken a very nuanced view and a balanced view on the Ukraine war. So if I look at South Africa, Brazil, India, China, these are the countries which are important players in the world. They represent very interesting geographies and continents. They have collectively and independently and therefore collectively decided that we will not back a war, but we will not also say that, you know, one country is responsible for the mess, and just paint one country as the villain of the piece. Geopolitics and every conflict always has so many different dimensions. So I think we should actually celebrate the fact that in today's world, in 2023, countries are willing to stand up for their views and what their beliefs are, and they are decoupling it in many ways from their business interests as well.
Yeah, certainly, India has done quite well. They've, seem to have mopped up the entire European share of the Russian oil market. And in the sort of greatest irony, then selling refined products to the very countries that have imposed the sanctions in the first place. So I suppose that is obviously quite smart economics on India's behalf, and well done to India to sort of make a massive industry out of the war. One would imagine. So
But
about
you know,
time.
there is Michael. There has been a high level of hypocrisy here from European Union as well. They were asking India to stop buying oil from Russia, while they continue to buy oil and gas from Russia even during that period. And it's very interesting that again India took the position and declared very publicly that the amount of oil that India buys in 6 months from Russia is equal to what the European Union buys in one afternoon. So it wasn't as if India was very highly dependent on Russia. But the other hypocrisy which comes through is that India continued to do its oil trade. It refined the products, and the refined products were absolutely, European Union was absolutely fine in buying those products. North America was absolutely fine in buying these products, knowing very well where the origin of the raw material was. If they wanted to take a really principled stand, they should not have bought anything which was emanating from Russia. But they also cannot do that because the dependence on Russian oil and gas is so high. So I don't think you can be asking others to stop using a certain product which you are using in dollars. So in many ways, what the rest of the countries saw in continents like Asia, Latin America, and Africa is a lot of double standards which came to the fore in this entire process. You told others and lectured others, but you did exactly what you were telling others not to do. So I think people are not going to blindly follow Europe and North America anymore. They are going to see what the reality is and follow that path rather than just be slaves to a certain perception.
Which sort of leads us beautifully into the growth of BRICS. And adding 6 more countries to BRICS, there's 2 aspects or 2 questions that come out there when one looks at the 6 countries that have been added. Are they the right 6? The countries were left out, like Indonesia, Mexico, etc., large, that really come very close to the original BRIC idea of large economies, high growth countries, in favor of smaller countries, in most cases oil producers, or in many cases oil producers, and in many cases almost antagonistic to, openly antagonistic to the first world. Now, we do understand that it's a multipolar world. Does one have to then spoil for a fight, be it economic or even worse, by doing this? Do you think it was the right 6 to have chosen?
Well, it's always a difficult choice to make. I'm not aware of all the reasons why these 6 were chosen versus the others who could have been part of it. But I think the fundamentals and the principles remain as they are, which is that these are countries which now are very important in the global economy. They are responsible for more than 30% of the global GDP. They are responsible for, they're amongst the top producers of oil. I have recently written, as you have seen, my view is, Michael, that there are three elements which are going to emerge out of this. One, you will see that these countries have together going to demand changes in the multilateral fora of the world. Uh, One of the my understanding is that one of the criterion for inviting these countries, these six in the first phase, was to bring their support and their like-minded in their approach to say that the current structures of United Nations, the Security Council, if you look at the World Bank, IMF, WTO, they're all controlled either by North America or by European Union, which is not something which we should tolerate for much longer. Uh, these were created in a post-World War situation where these countries were dominant, but as I said earlier, the center of gravity of the economy, global economy, is now shifted out of the West. It's moved to Asia and Africa. Often now it's being called the global South, and the global south is now a very powerful grouping of countries as a descriptor. Again, this is not a formal grouping. Now, these countries say that we cannot we do not want to live in a structure which is a 75-year-old structure where the structures were created in a colonial and a post-imperial era. Today, we are in a very different phase. Our citizens, the millennials and the Gen Z, they don't recall or they don't believe in those colonial concepts anymore. No, neither do we. So why should those structures still be alive? So that's one big shift. You will see what is common between all these countries, the current BRICS, the expanded BRICS, and those who would like to join BRICS. All of them are united in demanding a better and more equitable structure which reflects the diversity of the world and its people. Second big shift that is been articulated, and you will see, is that partly because of what happened in Ukraine, the huge financial and economic isolation of Russia has scared a lot of countries and their leaders. If you disagree with a certain country, would you then suddenly be excommunicated? Would you be made a pariah and you are disconnected from the financial system? That's a big scare. And that is again a view that it is a lever to control another country. We have a situation where countries are not comfortable with that anymore. So you will see, and last few months we have seen a lot of trade happening between countries in their own local currencies. Now you could argue that it's too early, but yes, it may be too early right now for countries to be completely independent of the dollar or the petrodollar. But what is definitely confirmed is that you will see that countries within the BRICS, the expanded BRICS, will increasingly trade in their own currency. Now, once they start trading in their own currency, you will see the linkages between them change to a completely new level. I believe that this will be a very important factor in the growth of BRICS, because BRICS will therefore now represent countries who feel that they can have, or at least create, some kind of a financial structure which is not entirely dependent on the dollar. So I see that as a very big development coming out of the expanded BRICS, especially with the oil producing nations coming into play.
And yeah.
Please go ahead.
No, sorry, that obviously speaks to the thing, and I know it featured strongly in your article and even in our discussions, is bilateral trade done in the currencies of the two parties. Makes a lot of sense. It makes all the sense in the world, especially when one looks at trade between, for example, South Africa and India, where there is some room to expand trade. There is no question. I presume these two countries would be quite comfortable in dealing in the currency. Do current mechanisms allow South Africa to export products to India and import vice versa in currencies of those two countries. Do you think the systems are adequate in allowing that?
I don't have those details, Michael. I can't say I'm an expert in foreign exchange
Yes.
trade issues on this point, but what I know is that these are not very difficult to create. There are some challenges, of course. So India has a history of bilateral trade in non-dollar currencies. We've had the rupee ruble trade for several decades. So India has that, and I think other countries are rapidly changing it. There are new ways of conducting trade which are based on digital commerce, which are coming through as well. My belief is that these are going to be evolving. New structures will be found, new systems will be found. And the question that you pose is very valid. Do we have the structures to be able to do that? Perhaps not enough, but I think that there is a commitment to do bilateral trade in regional currencies that will definitely go through, because one of the interesting things that has occurred in the last few months again is that the demand for gold has grown, and one of the biggest buyers of gold are now central banks of various countries. They now want to increase their holding of gold as a reserve rather than just the dollar. So there is a fear factor which says that let us reduce our dependence on dollar. Dollar is not going away. I'm not saying that it's going to disappear, but there is going to be a reduction in the dependence on dollar. So countries believe that should there be another conflict in the future, if for some reason they are facing the brunt of economic sanctions, or what many economists say is the weaponization of the currency, they would be in a better situation to manage it. Imagine if all your money is kept in dollar and the dollar accounts are frozen, what do you do? It becomes a serious crisis for any country. There is a strong movement for self-reliance in today's world. Every country wants to ensure that, and this is not just about the US. There is, you see that the West as well, US and Europe are now trying to reduce their dependence on China. The trade war and the conflict that you see, the economic conflict you see between US, Europe, and China, is that they realize that manufacturing effectively disappeared out of US and Europe. Now they're trying to revive manufacturing back in US and Europe to ensure that China does not hold them to account by saying that, well, we are not going to be able to ship certain products, and that halts the entire process of manufacturing. A single component which is made only in China and nowhere else can hold back a larger system, maybe an automobile or a semiconductor which is manufactured. So there is a rebalancing taking place, Michael, and I believe BRICS is an example of that rebalancing. It may not be perfect. The questions you raise are very valid. It is going to be a bit messy. It is going to be clunky, but the direction and the intent is very clear. Most countries outside North America and Europe want to create their own structures, frameworks, which will reduce their dependence on the legacy economies. I have been saying this now for a while, that we have to look at legacy economies in a different lens from the growth economies. Growth economies are not just the countries which are of high growth. Growth economies are also countries which have the potential to grow the most. So South Africa, as you said earlier, may not have a high growth rate now, but it has the potential, if it can get its internal issues and economic reforms in place, to be a very fast growing economy, because the consuming masses are in South Africa and in India and in East Africa, for example. So, but legacy economies like Europe and North America have peaked. They've reached where they could reach. For them, the consuming populations are not growing. The consuming populations are growing in Asia and Africa. So the growth potential, when I say growth economies, the growth potential is in these areas and regions. Of course, there is a responsibility of these countries to improve their own capability, their capacity. provide adequate power. I know that there is an energy crisis in South Africa that needs to be resolved. There is a need for investing in basic economic infrastructure in Southern Africa, not just in your country. So those are essential elements for these countries, and I hope that a formation like BRICS can come together and collaborate with a country like South Africa and invest in the basic infrastructure of South Africa. That would be a fantastic, advantage for South Africa too.
Yeah, well, I've made this point before on your point of currencies, and we will know that the world would have shifted. We just recently had a situation where our president, had the law bent, and in order to keep him out of court for having taken some dollars for no real reason, and then had them stolen from him because he put them in a couch. But the point is that one day when when it's actually rupees or rubles that are stolen from him, we would know that our leaders are talking, are acting the way they're talking. Then we would have lived in a de-dollarized world. But at the moment, he does choose to get illicit money in dollars, and it's going to be like that for a little while until some of these currencies catch up. Pranjal, I just want to spend some time just talking about India. If anybody hasn't noticed, then they haven't been concentrating. India has undergone a dramatic change over the last 30 years. And that's really manifested over the last 5 or 6 with growth rates that outstrip anywhere in the world for a big economy. What has India done right? Because South Africa in that same period seems to have taken a completely different route.
Well, India, I'm glad you see it positively. A lot of us in India feel that India hasn't done enough. It has done a lot, but it hasn't done enough. But remember that until just 30 years ago, India was a very socialist command economy where the government decided everything until 1991, 92. The government was really responsible and deciding who should produce what, and the industry was completely under the control. Even something we in my view, the biggest shift was what we called the de-licensing of the economy. Until then, every industry had to get a license to manufacture or produce anything. Today, it's a free market. Anybody can set up any factory anywhere and produce whatever they feel like, as long as their investors and their lenders feel that it's viable. And therefore, the market decides that. It's not the government deciding whether your business is viable or not. So, of the last 30 years, I would say the last 30 years, first 20 years of those economic reforms, we had a slow shift to making a lot of changes. Last 10 years, previous 10 years from 2014 onwards, we've seen even more acceleration of it. I think what I would say is that we have brought in a lot of private sector play. We've allowed a lot of private capital to come into it. We have allowed entrepreneurship to thrive, even though there are serious issues of red tape and government licensing which remain. There has been a consistent effort to reduce that from what it used to be. So government interference in business has been steadily coming down. Private entrepreneurs, startup economy, the fact that we've had a strong educational foundation, not as good as I would like, but still we've had a talent pool, has allowed India to develop its own vibrant private sector. Again, if I were to compare it with China, for example, China's growth was mostly led by the government-led companies. They allowed a lot of foreign companies to come in, but they were contract manufacturing. China's own private sector is still not as vibrant as it should be. They're still under the control of the government. If you've noticed, some of the biggest entrepreneurs like Jack Ma and others are constantly questioned by the government, and sometimes they just disappear and they come back and they don't say a word. We don't have that in India. Some of our biggest industry leaders, billionaires, millionaires, are actually adding value. What is very interesting is partly because of the size, Indian industry sees India as its biggest market. And if you look at it, US and some of the leading economies of Europe also grew by first taking care of their own economic needs and their own consumers. It's only in the second phase that their companies started going to other parts of the world, and then they became multinational corporations. So what India did right was this. We allowed private sector in mobile telephony in 1995 onwards. We privatized a few companies. In 20 years ago, we started privatizing our airports. We have got private investment coming in highways. We have got private investment coming in ports. So private sector in India today plays a very critical role. Government remains as a good regulator, but look, in any country there will be a lot of noise. If you're inside the country, you will see a lot of news about, well, this needs to be improved, that needs to be improved. But the quality of conversations that we have has really shifted. Uh, in again in the last 5 years alone, two very big shifts that we've done in terms of fantastic foundational economic reform is to pass the law for goods and services tax, which creates a uniform tax structure across the country. India, as you know, is a federal structure with 29 states. So until this law came about, every state could levy its own tax on every product. So we were 29 tax markets, which was terrible for foreign investors and even for domestic investors. That change, which occurred in 2015, has now settled, and we are now, it occurred in 2019, it is now settled, and we are now in a position where we can say that India is a single tax market. The second big shift which occurred was we created a what we call the insolvency and bankruptcy code, which allowed banks to take back the assets of companies that had defaulted. Now, in this situation, before that, a company could continue to take money and it could continue to default. And we had a lot of cases of fraud where billions and billions of dollars worth of public sector money from the banks was taken away and never returned. So the industry promoters became very fat and rich, but the industries themselves collapsed. This law of bankruptcy and insolvency has now improved the state of Indian banking system from multi-billion dollar non-performing assets, which is also called losses. They've come back to profitability in the last 8 years. So some of these economic reforms led by a strong leadership has made a very big impact. There is still a lot of things that we need to do. I won't say we are perfect, anywhere near perfect, but I think we are on a journey of improvement.
Now, as a geopolitician and somebody that looks at these issues, what do you make of South Africa that's going in exactly the opposite direction in almost every respect? We have ever declining standards of education. Our teachers' union, highly unionized, and really failing to produce the results that any modern economy requires, but they're in league with the government, so they can pretty much do what they like. As well as massively discriminatory commercial and business laws. I mean, to the point that if you want a mining license, you, Pranjal Sharma, could get a mining license in South Africa as a previously disadvantaged person. And the only people that couldn't get a mining license are white males. What do you make of South Africa's laws, our increasing centralization? We've got a Minister of Trade and Industry that, for example, hates trade and industry. What do you make of this? Do you think that eventually market forces will force South Africa into to seeing the light, or do you think we still have a long way to go?
Michael, I don't have as much information about these laws as you mentioned, but let me suggest this as a way ahead. I think if I were to use BRICS as a benchmark, it would be good for every country in BRICS to learn the best practices of their partner countries. India should learn from Brazil, Brazil should learn from South Africa, South Africa should learn from India, and look at how steps were taken and how the impact of that step, of a specific step, improved the economic situation of that particular country. I believe that South Africa, India, Brazil, and Russia, and even China have to share and help each other adopt the best practices, best policies, best laws to ensure that there is a good entrepreneurial atmosphere in each of these countries. We have to look at the fact that if any of these countries are not adopting it, we have option to give them some great advice. I am hoping that BRICS will also form the foundation to support and share these examples with each other. And I think that any country like South Africa, which is seen as a as a beacon, not just for the global South but for the African continent, will be able to adopt some of these forward-looking measures. You know, internal politics of every country is always complex. We have similar situations in India where every progressive measure is questioned by the opposition, which wants to actually say that no, we will not allow you to privatize roads because you are selling our assets to private companies. Why is a private company coming into building shipping ports, and why is a railway line being offered to the manufacturer or private sector getting involved in railway lines and the railway services? So these debates are there in India. We are a very strong, vocal, and loud democracy. I think you would have a similar situation in South Africa. I think it's for the political leadership of each country to agree on a basic common minimum economic agenda. Today, you have the option of seeing what like-minded countries are doing. You don't have to follow the model of Europe or North America. You can follow the model of countries which have had a similar economic journey. The socio-economic issues for India and South Africa are very similar. India, South Africa, and Brazil are similar. We need to improve the education of billions of people in India. We have hundreds of millions of people who want better education, better health services in India, and the government is taking a lot of steps for it. It's involving private sector to come into it. So I can't say specifically about South Africa, but I'm hoping that BRICS can be the group and the club that can allow South Africa to learn from some of the best examples across the region, across the grouping.
Well, Pranjal, we all live in hope. We hope that South Africa will learn from India, which is growing and lifting people out of poverty with some very common sense policies. Sadly, as the initial action showed, our president chose to shun, Prime Minister Modi in favor of greeting Xi Jinping at the airport. We know that created a little ruckus at the start. Let's hope that in future South Africa chooses the path of growth and poverty alleviation that India is on. And you've been fantastically generous with your time. We're going to get you back to discuss this book, which is essential reading, and on quite in the near future. But Pranjal Sharma, thank you so much for joining us today on the State of the Nation. It's been wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure to have this insightful conversation with you.
And if you've watched this podcast, go ahead and subscribe. Join the State of the Nation family. We're doing some good things here and getting the information out to you. But to everybody that's joined us today, to Pranjal Sharma, thank you so much, and we'll see you again on the State of the Nation.